Good afternoon and welcome back. This is the Midday Report and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. And we begin our service with the latest from Strasbourg. European foreign ministers have concluded an informal meeting on the latest peace talks on Ukraine. While we're waiting for a press conference with EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, we are joined live by our correspondent Kazimierz Łysiak, who is in Brussels. Good afternoon, Kazimierz. So can you tell us more about the priorities for the peace process laid out by the European Commission earlier in the day?
Good afternoon, Claudia. As we are waiting for the presser of Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas here in Brussels, in Strasbourg, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has indeed presented the priorities of the EU when it comes to the US peace plan. And at first, when the peace plan was first announced, the European leaders were rather hesitant to criticize it. Now they are coming with some rather strong points, which differ quite a lot from the points proposed first by the United States. The bottom line is that the EU is firmly against Ukraine officially ceding any territories to Russia and also against putting any limitations on the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, reportedly, Ukraine has agreed to some limits to around 800,000 troops. That's about as much as they have right now. But the EU says that it shouldn't be put on Ukraine any limitations, that they should be put instead, possibly, on the aggressor in the conflict. Let's listen to some of the words that Ursula von der Leyen gave in Strasbourg earlier in the day.
I want to start this debate not in Geneva, but in Ternopil, a city in western Ukraine, closer to the Polish border than it is to Kyiv. In the early hours of one morning last week, a storm of Russian drones and missiles rained down. The sheer force of the attacks leading to an inferno erupting. In the burning wreckage laid injured victims and more than 30 dead, innocent men, women and children. Children like Amelka. Amelka, a 7-year-old girl from Poland. I want to start by paying my respect and deepest condolences to all those mourning the victims of Ternopil and right across Ukraine.
So as you can hear, the President of the European Commission setting the tone here at the beginning of her speech. And this only goes to show you how different the situation is for Europe and how different it is for the United States. The original peace proposal, the 28 points, included, for example, something about the United States receiving some compensation or profits from the future reconstruction of Ukraine. Meanwhile, for Europe, it is definitely much more of an existential crisis, an existential threat, rather than a business deal. As you've heard from the European Commission President, the war is happening just beyond Poland's border, and that is a completely different perspective. But let's also listen to some of her points on the most important security guarantees that the EU would like to see in the peace proposal.
As a sovereign nation, there can be no limitations on Ukraine's armed forces that would leave the country vulnerable to future attacks. And this is as much about deterrence as it is about Europe's security, because Ukraine's security is Europe's security, so Ukraine needs robust, long-term and credible security guarantees as part of a wider package to dissuade and deter any future attacks from Russia.
So these points are some of the most crucial for the European Union, and it is part of Europe's diplomatic efforts to support Kyiv after this peace proposal from the United States. We are already seeing Donald Trump backing off a little bit and saying that this is only a starting point for the negotiations. So we will see how much Europe can convince Donald Trump to have some better conditions for Ukraine to ensure a just and lasting peace. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Kazimierz. This was Kazimierz Łysiak reporting live from Brussels. And we continue. This latest development, revealed by Bloomberg, could disrupt the delicate balancing act of trying to reach a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. Fresh leaks from the Kremlin have thrust Washington's internal struggle over Ukraine back into the spotlight. The reason? A recorded call reportedly between U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin's top advisor hints at quiet negotiations far closer to Moscow's terms than previously acknowledged, just as Kyiv, Washington and Europe tried to keep fragile peace talks alive.
A new leak from inside the Kremlin has blown open Washington's uneasy balancing act over Ukraine. A transcript published by Bloomberg suggests U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff privately told Vladimir Putin's top advisor Yuri Ushakov that he could pressure both Kyiv and Donald Trump into accepting a Moscow-leaning deal. Ushakov didn't deny the conversation happened, but called parts of it, quote, fake and leak itself unacceptable. The call reportedly took place in mid-October, just days before President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Washington seeking long-range missiles. Witkoff allegedly floated concession on Donetsk and even land swaps, while the Kremlin held to its maximalist demands: recognition of occupied territories, limits on Ukraine's military, and abandoning NATO membership. Trump brushed off concerns, calling Witkoff's actions standard, but the leak deepens uncertainty over who is driving U.S. policy. Kyiv says it remains ready to talk, while analysts argue Zelensky now approaches negotiations with tougher political instincts after months of painful signaling from Washington. And Europe is watching closely, as experts warn that several figures around Trump share striking overlaps with Moscow's framing of the conflict.
It was very clear from the beginning that the positions of Steve Witkoff and of a number of people close to Donald Trump, such as Vice President J.D. Vance, such as Jared Kushner, has been quite close to what Russia has been presenting, and they've been suggesting that normalization of ties with Russia, particularly on the business front, is in the interest of the U.S. and should happen.
According to NBC News, the Trump administration is now split into two camps. J.D. Vance and Witkoff urging concessions to Russia to end the war quickly, and Marco Rubio pushing for pressure, sanctions and accountability. Trump reportedly moves between both visions. A rift diplomats warn could shape the next U.S. election cycle. Witkoff travels to Moscow next week, but with Kyiv and Washington still divided on key points, the path to any agreement remains narrow. Every leak only sharpens the question of who will set the terms, and for whose benefit.
What appeared as a plan turned out to be rather a concept, and the final arrangement is still a vague prospect. Meanwhile, former senior U.S. diplomats are slamming Trump's plan as a distant shadow of the 1938 Munich Pact, victimizing Ukraine and expecting no concessions from Russia. Moreover, experts doubt Moscow is ready for peace.
Donald Trump's peace plan is no longer a plan, but a concept that can be worked on and improved without a deadline.
That was just a map. All that was is a map. That was not a plan. It was a concept. And from there, they've taken each one of the 28 points, and then you get down to 22 points. A lot of them were solved, and actually very favorably solved. So we'll see what happens.
Ukraine, which no longer faces a do-or-die dilemma, now sees a chance to clinch a more favorable peace deal.
The principles of this document can be developed into deeper agreements, and this is our common interest for security to be real. I count on further active cooperation with the American side and with President Trump. A lot depends on America.
Former U.S. diplomats who spoke to TVP World have slammed Trump's peace plan, which includes a cap on Ukraine's troop numbers and ceding territory to Russia.
The 28-point program, which is still evolving, is a horrible starting point for this phase of negotiations. There are no territorial demands on the aggressor. There are no caps being expected upon the aggressor's forces.
Michael Carpenter, who under the Biden administration served as senior director for Europe at the National Security Council, says that the talks are doomed to fail.
I don't think this diplomacy is going to produce a breakthrough for the simple reason that Vladimir Putin is not going to want any kind of credible security guarantee that stops the fighting sufficiently to allow Ukraine to proceed with European integration and to create an independent, sovereign, democratic state integrated into the European Union. That is a strategic defeat for Vladimir Putin, and he won't allow for any agreement that gives Ukraine that opportunity.
Foreign policy expert and former U.S. Defense Department official Ian Brzezinski says a just peace can only be achieved if Vladimir Putin feels that his regime is threatened.
Putin requires two things to cause him to change course. One, he has to see his territorial gains, these illegal territorial gains, to be put at risk. And then two, he has to see his own regime being put at risk. The West has the capacity to do that. It just has to act.
Next week, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff will travel to Moscow with Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to further negotiate the peace plan with Vladimir Putin.
Putin must realize that he has no chance of winning this war at the expense of European freedom and peace, ladies and gentlemen, said German Chancellor Friedrich Merz on Wednesday in the German Bundestag. The leader endorsed Washington's involvement in trying to bring the war in Ukraine to an end and announced that Germany will not only continue the support for Ukraine, but up the amount by further 3 billion euros.
We will not slow down in our support for Ukraine. We will support the Ukrainian people for as long as necessary. And we want to make the frozen Russian assets available precisely for this purpose. Putin must realize that he has no chance of winning this war at the expense of European freedom and peace, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why Germany will continue to provide Ukraine with a very high level of support in the 2026 federal budget. In light of recent events, we have increased the amount by a further 3 billion euros to a total of 11.5 billion euros. And we are making a further 170 billion euros available immediately for infrastructure. This is to mitigate the effects of Russia's terror campaign against Ukraine's winter supplies.
According to media reports, it will be the Swedish defense company Saab which will supply the Polish Navy with new submarines. The contract is yet another move by the Polish authorities to swiftly modernize the country's armed forces, an initiative undertaken after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began.
This is the only submarine in service in the Polish Navy, ORP Orzeł, or Eagle in English, and it's 40 years old. That's why the Polish government wants to replace it with brand new vessels. The name of the program, Orka, which is Polish for killer whale.
Today we're making the final decision on the purchase of 3 modern submarines.
According to leaks in Polish media, the government has already decided and chosen Swedish defence company Saab as the new submarine supplier for the Navy. The contract would see Saab building 3 new vessels in its Kockums shipyard in Karlskrona. The company will supply the Polish Navy with the newest Bleking-class submarines, also known as Type A26, and featuring many stealth technologies. Although still not official, the choice of Saab should not come as a surprise. For starters, the Swedish company already builds ships for the Polish Navy.
We are now also delivering the 2 Sigint vessels for Poland. They are being built now in Gdansk at Remontowa shipbuilding together with our Polish partners.
And choosing a Swedish company helps to strengthen Baltic ties, which have been paramount to the government in Warsaw.
We see threats in the Baltic every day, whether it's cutting undersea cables, threats to critical infrastructure, GPS disruptions, which make maritime and air traffic difficult, not to mention airspace violations. There isn't a Baltic country that hasn't had its airspace violated by the Russians.
The price tag for the submarines could be anywhere between 4 and 5 billion euros, making Orka the costliest purchase in the history of the Polish Navy. Part of the programme could be financed by loans from the EU under the SAFE initiative.
And now let's move to Greece. The Olympic flame has been lit ahead of the Milano Cortina 2026 Winter Games to be held in Italy beginning in February. Key Olympic figures gathered in Greece for the Olympic flame lighting ceremony, including the president of the International Olympic Committee, Christy Coventry, and the president of Greece. The symbolic event was held at the Archaeological Museum in Olympia. Unfavorable weather conditions forced the historic ceremony to be moved indoors for the first time since 1968. The torch will now be raided across Italy's cities to cultural landmarks carried by thousands of relay runners until it finally reaches Milan's San Siro Stadium on February 6th. And so this would be all for now here at the Midday Report. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Kaja Kallas, and I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more news and features in just a moment.